They thought she'd cry. They thought she'd beg. But when Valeria left the Emperor's ring untouched, she didn't just reject a man. She rewrote the rules of empire. I'm Alfred, and today I will be telling you a story about a powerful woman who didn't raise her voice to be heard. She let the silence speak for her. In a world where thrones were built on the backs of obedient daughters, she chose something far more dangerous than rebellion. She chose herself. This is the tale of a woman who slipped through the cracks of history but left a fire in every place she touched. Her name was Cass, and once you hear her story, you'll never forget what it means to live without asking permission. Interested in the story? Keep on watching and let me know where you are watching from. The marble halls of the Cassia estate rang with quiet celebration, as if joy itself had to be restrained to match the dignity of Roman nobility. But Valeria felt none of it as she sat beside the fountain, her eyes on the still water, watching the reflection of her father's guests ripple with every false toast. The servant approached with measured steps, carrying a polished silver tray upon which rested the Emperor's ring, heavy with seal and implication, offered as both honor and sentence. To the senators assembled in the atrium, it meant favor, protection, a binding with General Aulus Severus that would secure their family's position for generations. To Valeria, it was a shackle of velvet and blood. Her mother's eyes begged compliance without words. Her father's stare warned against defiance. But Valeria stood without speaking, the silk of her stola whispering as she walked to the tray, and for a moment everyone held their breath, waiting for her to lift the ring, to accept her place, to give Rome another obedient wife behind closed doors. Instead, she looked down at the ring, gleaming, smug, heavy with empire, and then, with hands steady as stone, she turned and left it where it lay. No outburst, no farewell, only silence. Her steps echoed down the corridor, past the marble busts and painted frescoes, past the history her family carved into columns and urns. When she reached the servants' quarters, she pulled a coarse cloak from a peg and wrapped it around her body, hiding the wealth, the lineage, the woman they all tried to cage. No one stopped her. They were too busy whispering, too stunned by her absence to realize what it meant. She moved through the streets of Rome as dusk bled into darkness, hood drawn low, eyes sharp. The city smelled of spices and sewage, of wine and smoke, of beauty and cruelty layered together in sandstone and ash. She walked past merchants closing stalls, past guards laughing with wine on their breath, past women who looked through her and saw no threat, and that was her first advantage. She wasn't running, she wasn't lost. She had watched for years, learned how power moved, how men gestured when lying, how letters were passed in sandals, how keys were kept on strings of flesh, not iron. She had spent her girlhood in silence because no one thought silence was dangerous. Now, that silence was her weapon. At the edge of Subura, where the villas gave way to tenements and the whispers grew sharper than blades, she stepped into a candle-lit apothecary and handed over a coin wrapped in parchment. The woman behind the counter read the note and nodded once, leading her to a back room filled with crates, blankets, and the scent of dried herbs and fear. "You'll be Cassia no more," the woman said, pressing a bundle of plain garments into her arms. "From now on, you're just Cass." Valeria took the clothes and changed in silence, slipping into the life she had crafted one careful observation at a time. Outside, the empire continued its drunken feast, oblivious. Inside, a girl born of empire vanished into shadow. She hadn't raised a weapon. She hadn't uttered a threat. But tonight, the rebellion began, with a ring left untouched and a tray of silver cold in the hands of Rome. The room she slept in now was no larger than the atrium fountain she once sat beside. Its walls cracked with age, its floor littered with straw and the echo of 100 tired breaths. But Valeria, now Cass, lay still beneath the thin blanket, eyes open long before the dawn bell. She'd taken nothing from her family, but the knowledge they never bothered to see in her, the careful memories of conversations not meant for her ears, and the daily humiliation of knowing that her silence had always been mistaken for consent. In the alleys and dens of Subura, names were currency, and she had traded hers for anonymity. Cass was no longer the daughter of a senator, no longer the prize bride for a general's greed. She was a girl who swept floors at the healers' quarters, who fetched water and crushed herbs and never looked anyone in the eye unless she meant it. Most believed her mute. A few thought her slow. None knew she could read faster than the city scribes, or that she remembered every face who ever spoke in cruelty. During the day, she moved like ash between shadows, unseen but present, slipping through the layers of Rome's forgotten. A laundress with a bruised wrist here, a cook who hummed lullabies as she stirred broth, a blind beggar who once taught her how to navigate a crowd by sound alone. At night, she sat by the dying fire of the apothecary's back room and wrote everything down, not in letters, but in symbols, marks only she could decipher, recording whispers of rebellion even before they had names. When a limping soldier came to the healer's table, clutching a stab wound, Cass cleaned it without flinching. "Old Legion," he said, watching her hands. "You've the hands of a noble, but your eyes, those are street eyes." She said nothing, only wrapped his wound tighter. He laughed, coughed blood, and before he left, he pressed a small wooden coin into her palm. "If you ever need to vanish twice, show this." She didn't ask what it meant. She simply added it to her pouch. The healer, old, bent and sharp as boiled bone, taught her plants that could numb a tongue or stop a heart. "Most poison is just dose," she'd say. "Learn that and you'll know how to survive anyone." One day, a noble's wife came, hidden behind a veil, her eye blackened. Cass served her tea with crushed lotus and listened as the woman whispered, "If only I could disappear." Cass gently touched the woman's hand and slid a small folded cloth beneath her sleeve. A map of alleyways, an escape. No words, just possibility. She did this often. A message here, a hint there, always through silence, never seen giving anything, only eyes meeting eyes long enough to plant courage like a seed. And those seeds began to grow. A merchant's widow started buying more grain than needed. A street girl began walking routes only soldiers knew. A boy started sketching the guard rotations into the dust by the stables. Cass said nothing, but her silence became a language. Not everyone noticed, but those who did began to wait for her glance. She wasn't leading a rebellion, not yet. She was preparing a world where one could exist, because a woman like her didn't need to be followed. She only needed to be remembered. And already, in the dark corners of Rome, her shape was forming in the minds of the weary and the watchful. The empire had built walls around women like Cass, but she had found the cracks. The steam from the women's baths curled like ghosts around the pillars, softening the marble and melting secrets into vapor. And Cass walked barefoot through it all, her hair wrapped in cloth, her tunic faded and damp, her eyes lowered just enough to be ignored, but never so much that she missed anything. Here, in this sanctuary of scorned wives, neglected daughters, and powerful matrons, the empire stripped itself bare, not just of clothing, but of masks. It was in these walls that women confessed their sins and their sorrows beneath murmurs and oils, where the perfume of politics mixed with crushed lavender and shame. Cass learned early that the most guarded truths were shared not in temples or courts, but in hushed voices between rinsed hair and anointed skin. She never asked questions, never offered more than she was given. Her hands massaged tired limbs while her ears captured the pulse of Rome. A patrician's wife let slip that her husband hid gold under the mosaic tiles of their villa. Another wept as she spoke of her son taken for Nero's games, never to return. One spoke with quiet rage about her sister drowned for refusing a match. None of them knew who Cass truly was, but a few began to recognize that the girl with the silent touch and the unblinking gaze could be trusted, not because she promised safety, but because she never asked for thanks. One afternoon, a young woman named Livia, barely older than Cass, collapsed onto the marble bench beside her and whispered, "The tribunes change shifts every 4th day now. My father's house overlooks their path." She said it like it meant nothing, but her hand trembled as she passed Cass a towel, and inside it was a scrap of parchment, just 4 names, all centurions known for cruelty. Cass tucked it beneath her belt without a word. Later that week, she slid a sprig of oleander into Livia's robe as she passed. No words exchanged, only a nod. Another day, the baths emptied quickly after whispers of an imperial envoy riding past, and Cass remained behind with a slave girl scrubbing blood from her arm. "He made me kiss his boots," the girl said, voice shaking. "Said I was born to serve." Cass didn't speak. She reached into her pouch, pulled out a salve of honey, fig and vinegar, and gently cleaned the wound. Then she drew a circle in the steam-covered wall, one within another, and met the girl's eyes. The girl nodded. That symbol began appearing across the bathhouses, etched behind vases, hidden in the folds of towels, pressed into the wax of abandoned candles. To some, it meant nothing. But to those who listened, it meant someone was watching. Someone was willing to act. And it meant hope could be passed between women like steam, unseen but felt. Cass never once claimed a title, never declared a war. But in the hidden heat of Rome's luxury, she built her quiet army with the only weapons women had ever been allowed: their hands, their pain, and their silence. And that silence was no longer lonely. It was collective. It was sharp. It was waiting. The forum bustled with the frenzy of mid-morning trade, voices thick with barter and pride, spices and sweat swirling in the air like war drums muffled by linen and coin. But Cass moved through the chaos as if it parted for her. The market had once been a place she feared, where the scent of roasting meat reminded her of how easily blood boiled, where women were prodded and priced beside crates of olives, where generals paraded their victories by the weight of their purses and the sheen of their mistresses' hair. But now it was a hunting ground, not for revenge, not yet, but for truth. Beneath her plain cloak, Cass carried no name, no crest, no right to speak, but she carried a dagger tied inside a basket of pomegranates, its handle wrapped in cloth the color of ash. She wasn't there to kill. She was there to see. She watched as a senator's son slapped a fruit vendor for a price he'd already agreed to, watched the vendor bite down on his tongue rather than speak, watched the man's guards laugh, watched the vendor's daughter stare at Cass as if asking, "Will anyone remember this?" Cass nodded once. That night, a pattern of apples arranged just so, on a cart, Green, red, red, green appeared near the vendor's stall. When the senator's son returned days later, his purse was gone before he noticed, his sandals cut just enough to tear during his march up the Capitol steps. A warning, not a wound. She didn't believe in chaos. She believed in memory, and the market remembered. A boy with a clubfoot limped beside her, offering figs, his eyes flicking up to hers with recognition. She handed him a single coin, unmarked, tin, worthless to Rome, and he darted off with a grin, disappearing into the butcher's tent. Minutes later, Cass found a fresh scroll beneath a sack of grain, guard shift changes near the aqueducts, scribbled in a child's hand. Trusted, unquestioned, valued. Not all her allies knew her face, but they knew the signs. A blue thread tied to a beam, a cracked jug placed upside down, a pomegranate missing its crown. Every day the market offered her more than food. It offered her proof that the city itself was hungry for change. Her dagger never left the basket. She didn't need to draw it to make it dangerous. Its presence was enough. One afternoon, a man tried to corner her behind a spice stall, grabbing her wrist with the casual cruelty of those who think no one will notice. Cass let him speak, let him sneer, let his grip tighten. Then she let her basket fall. The dagger landed between his feet with a soft clink, point first. He looked down, looked up. Her eyes didn't waver. She didn't blink. He let go. And as he walked away, 3 women from neighboring stalls turned to her in silence. One nodded. One smiled. One began grinding pepper with new fervor. The story of the dagger spread not in shouts, but in pealed whispers passed over figs and barley and salted fish. A dagger had landed in the market, and no one saw the hand that drew it. Cass hadn't started a war. She had simply reminded the city what it felt like to be watched by someone who would not forget. They called her the Widow before she ever donned the veil. The name moved faster than she did, whispered by those too afraid to speak aloud, sewn into the silence between a wife's bruised cheek and her sister's clenched jaw. It began after the merchant's wife vanished, the one whose screams used to echo down the stones of Vicus Patricius at midnight. One day she was there, the next she was gone, and in her place a carefully carved circle was burned into her door, double-ringed, with a small triangle at its heart. No one knew what it meant, but the guards began watching more closely, and still the signs multiplied. The next was a mistress of a praetorian, seen limping with shame one evening, gone the next. Then a slave girl who'd been paraded with chains, now wearing a black ribbon around her wrist and standing straighter than anyone had seen. Rome was used to blood. It did not know what to do with precision. And Cass, now fully become the widow, was no longer hiding. She moved with purpose through the low quarters and the places where law looked away. She spoke now, rarely but firmly, and only to those who'd proven themselves. "You are not alone," she whispered to a mother who brought her child bruised by a magistrate's whip. "But we cannot save everyone, only those willing to disappear before they return." She gave the woman a ring carved from bone and the name of a baker who owed her silence. In return, the woman offered her the names of 3 men who sold girls near the docks. Cass didn't blink. "That's enough," she said. That night, 2 of the men vanished. The third was found with a note nailed to his stall. "Let the daughters live." In the higher circles, noblewomen began requesting their baths drawn by a new girl, the one with the quiet hands and the eyes like obsidian. Some began to ask her questions. She only ever answered with riddles. What do you seek that you cannot buy? Or would you rather be feared or remembered? And sometimes she simply placed a ring of nettle in their basin, a warning, a promise, or an invitation. Word reached the Senate halls in the form of nervous jest. "Have you heard of this widow?" One lord laughed. "I'd marry her if she exists." His laughter stopped when he found his prized stallion dead the next day, a single black veil tied around its neck. Cass didn't raise armies. She raised the stakes. And Rome, glutted on its own cruelty, began to choke on the idea that a woman, silent, nameless, unbought, might be orchestrating their fear. She didn't need to shout. She let her legend grow in the mouths of others. It was no longer about her survival. It was about making sure no woman ever had to barter hers again. The invitation arrived, rolled in red silk, bound by Nero's seal, a command, not a request. It smelled faintly of rosewater and iron, and it was addressed not to Valeria Cassia, long presumed vanished, but to the healer's assistant, known as Cassia Minor. She read it once, then burned it in the brazier, watching the flames curl as if licking away the memory of the man who once believed he would own her. General Gaius Marcellus, the same to whom she'd been promised like a basket of fruit. He had returned from campaigns in the north with new scars and old appetites, demanding tribute from every house that had once bowed to him. The dinner was to be held in his honor, and whispers said he wanted to reclaim what was his. Cass donned no veil that night. She wore a deep burgundy cloak, rough and unadorned, and carried with her only a pouch of oils, 2 herbs meant to slow the heart, and a single carved ring of blackwood. She entered the villa through the servants' path, blending with slaves and cooks, every step retracing a childhood memory of corridors built for others to rule. The atrium glowed with lamplight, senators and warlords sipping from goblets like gods among cattle. Gaius stood near the fountain, his voice booming, his face lined with age, but no wisdom. His eyes swept the room until they landed on her. "Valeria," he breathed, like a man seeing a ghost. She didn't flinch. "Cassia," she corrected. "I serve herbs and wounds now." He laughed, gestured for wine. "You were born to serve better than peasants." "I was born to choose," she replied. He studied her then, not as a man studies a woman, but as a hunter studies prey he once caught and lost. "Do you come in peace?" he asked. "I come to remember," she said. And she let him pour the wine. All around, the men chuckled, thinking it sport, thinking the lamb had returned to the slaughter. But she did not drink. And by morning, the general would be found slumped beside his golden chalice, heart slowed to a crawl, his mouth wet with spiced wine and regret. No one saw the widow slip away. No one dared accuse a woman of speaking too little. And by the next sunset, 3 veils were tied to the forum gates, each one darker than the last. The temple of Vesta, long guarded by virgin fire and sacred lies, had never welcomed women like Cass. It was a place reserved for daughters born to please gods and emperors alike, who bled their worth in silence and bowed when spoken to, their hair shorn and their words thinner than the flames they kept alive. But Cass walked beneath its marble arches, not as a supplicant, but as a shadow in flesh, carrying no offering but the truth. She wore the plain white tunic of a laundress and moved as though she belonged, because in every corner of Rome now, Cass belonged. A rumor of her had reached the temple weeks before, a whisper that the widow herself had entered the old sanctum and left behind a black ribbon tied to a broom. At first, it had been dismissed as a joke, until one of the Vestals, Claudia, barely 17, eyes too tired for youth, found a scroll beneath her pillow. "Your silence is not holy if it's stolen." That single line had gnawed at her, until finally she left an olive branch behind the temple. Cass found it, and in doing so found something more than alliance. She found memory. Claudia spoke of girls buried alive for the crime of disobedience, of silences demanded by men in robes who wept before statues but struck behind closed doors. Cass listened, as she always did, and then she placed a pomegranate seed in Claudia's hand. "You are not theirs anymore." Over the next days, more signs emerged. A crack in the altar was filled with ash, a vow bowl went missing, and one of the older Vestals was found weeping with a red thread in her palm. Slowly, even among the cloisters, change was threading its way through the marble. Cass knew temples were not toppled with blades. They were unravelled by faith undone. She left no mark on the holy ground, only questions. Who protected the protectors? Who lit the flame when no one watched? And what happens when the firekeeper burns brighter than the fire? When she departed through the eastern arch, the silence behind her felt different, less like obedience, more like breath being held. Cass didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had lit a match in a place built to smother them. Let Rome see if its gods could ignore that. By the time Nero held his latest banquet, the city smelled not of incense or wine, but of smoke. Not the fire of his childhood palace, nor the staged infernos he liked to blame on Christians, but something subtler, carried in the folds of togas and the whisper of olive trees. Ashes, the kind left when illusions burn. At first, no one noticed. A small house in Subura gone to cinders, a slave pen charred during the night, a magistrate's home burned from within, his gold left untouched, but every ledger turned to soot. Cass watched from rooftops, her cloak fluttering like a raven's wing as Rome began to crack beneath its own weight. She hadn't lit the fires herself. That wasn't her way. But those who followed her had begun to move without waiting. A girl whose sister was sold into marriage lit the brazier of her master's bed with oil-soaked parchment. A boy beaten for stealing bread sent sparks into the straw of his oppressor's stable. They did not scream rebellion. They simply said, "Enough." Cass felt the shift in the air, the way a storm announces itself with silence before the first thunder. The city was listening, and it was answering. She began marking maps with new precision, safe houses marked by veils in windows, allies confirmed by the scent of myrrh at the doorstep. Every district had a signal now. Every orphan knew who to trust by how they folded their sleeves. The widow's network had grown beyond what even she imagined. Yet power was not what she sought. It was responsibility. And with each fire, each whisper, each tremble in the bones of Rome, she felt the weight of it. One night, she found herself standing before her childhood villa, once her prison, now abandoned by her disgraced family. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on cold marble, each room a ghost of what was. In her father's study, she found the silver tray where the emperor's ring once rested. She picked it up, still polished, still empty. Cass smiled, then dropped it to the floor. It rang out once, sharp and final, a sound Rome would never understand, but would never forget. That night, ashes drifted across the Tiber like petals in mourning. The city would call it unrest. The nobles would call it sedition. But the women, the slaves, the broken and dismissed, they called it something else. They called it hope. Nero believed himself a god in flesh, a sun wrapped in silk and cruelty, his throne draped in gold and guarded by songs of sycophants. But even gods fear shadows. When the first scroll arrived on his pillow, no seal, no signature, only a line scrawled in soot, he laughed. "Even ghosts crave my attention," he told his court, waving the parchment like a jest. But the laughter died when his favorite courtesan vanished the next night, leaving only a black veil beneath his statue of Venus. The scrolls kept coming. "You stole her name. You silenced their songs. You will eat your own smoke." Nero stopped sleeping. He blamed his scribes, his priests, his guards, but none could explain how the scrolls appeared, how his chambers remained untouched, how the veils arrived without a sound. Rome buzzed with fear, but also something stranger, curiosity. The widow was no longer myth. She was present, felt in the tremble of noble hands, and the pause before every decree. Cass had never meant to. Confront Nero directly, but revolutions have gravity, and eventually all tyrants are pulled into orbit. She donned no armor. She wore no disguise. She entered the palace as a midwife's aide, carrying a basket of fig leaves and crushed balm, her face veiled but unremarkable. No one stopped her. Fear had become her cloak. Within the walls of opulence, she walked past drunken senators and marble gods, past murals of conquests and rooms soaked in velvet sin. She reached the emperor's private garden just as he arrived, flanked by trembling guards. He froze at the sight of her, this woman too calm for a slave, too steady for a servant. "Who are you?" he asked. "The one you tried to erase," she replied, lifting the veil not from her face, but from her story. "The girl your empire tried to marry off, the daughter who watched, the shadow who learned." Nero laughed, though his voice cracked. "You think you frighten me?" "I think I already have." She stepped forward and placed the final scroll on his lap. "You won't read it now, but one day, when your halls are empty and your fires cold, you will remember it." Then she turned and walked away. No guards stopped her. No alarms rang. Power, she knew, was not held in a blade, but in who the blade refused to cut. That night, Nero ordered 10 arrests. No one could find her. The widow had entered the lion's mouth and left unscathed. And in doing so, she'd done something greater than overthrowing a man. She'd made him irrelevant. Years passed. Rome shifted as it always had, trading emperors like coins, rebuilding what it burned, forgetting the names of the conquered. But one name endured, not in scrolls or statues, but in symbols etched quietly where only the right eyes could see. A circle, double-ringed, triangle at its heart. It appeared in alleyways, in temples, in birthrooms, where midwives whispered strength into newborn daughters. The widow never returned to public life. She didn't need to. Her work was not a rebellion, it was a blueprint. And across the empire, in places power never looked, women followed it. A noble daughter in Alexandria refused her suitor and fled into the Red Hills. A former slave in Hispania trained other women to wield knives as they once wielded ladles. A widow in Gaul turned her vineyard into a shelter for runaway girls. Each of them whispered a name, not in reverence, but in recognition. Cass, not the senator's daughter, not the emperor's consort, just Cass, the woman who chose not to bow. In the old villa, now overrun by vines, someone lit a candle each year on the night the imperial ring was first refused. No one claimed to do it. It simply appeared, flickering in the silence like memory. Rome never claimed her. History never named her. but in the margins of power, in the soft revolt of women who said no with their silence, she lived. Some said she died in the hills of Illyria. Others swore she fled east and taught daughters of spice merchants how to read war maps. But those were just endings written by men who needed closure. The truth was more dangerous. She lived on in every woman who refused to be bartered, in every girl who chose solitude over submission, in every mother who taught her child that fear was not inherited. She was never seen again, but she was everywhere. The empire continued, as empires do, bloated, decadent, convinced of its own permanence. But beneath its marble skin, cracks widened, and in the dust of forgotten halls, the name Cass was carved in places they never thought to look, not as a warning, as a promise. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story touched you, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us feel a little closer across the miles. Every story finds its home in the hearts of those who need it, and sometimes that's all it takes. If you'd like to hear more stories that lift the spirit and remind us of the quiet miracles around us, feel free to subscribe. We're building something meaningful here, and it means so much to have you along the way. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending this time with us.